Put your hands together, please. Kieran Cronin.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Kieran. Yes, I will be joined with John Maloney at a point during this talk. Firstly, just want to say thanks very much. It's a wonderful honour to be back here again this year and to have the opportunity to talk on a topic that is of real personal interest to me. And over the last 5 years, I've had the opportunity to travel throughout the southern states in America, spending time in some of the key sites where the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s took place, and getting the chance to talk about some of the information I found while I was there, and also to talk about Frederick Douglass. As I say, when we walk along the Mall here in Waterford, there's a blue plaque erected by the Waterford Civic Trust to Frederick Douglass, and on the plaque it says Frederick Douglass, American abolitionist, social reformer and statesman, who spoke here in Waterford in the large room of City Hall on the 9th of October 1845. And on that day he gave a lecture to the people of Waterford. And looking at that plaque, when I first came here to Waterford 8 years ago, it raised more questions than answers. Firstly, who was Frederick Douglass, and how was it that Douglass ended up in Waterford in the autumn and winter months of 1845? What was his significance to the abolitionist anti-slavery movement of the 19th century, and why has Douglass been widely accredited and known as the father of America's civil rights movement? And finally, in 2016, why does Frederick Douglass matter, and his legacy continues to live on in the message of the Black Lives Matters movement? So before I talk about Douglass, I wanted to talk about Waterford, and just to identify some points regarding Waterford's history and the abolitionist civil rights movement. And the most visible connection is with our own Thomas Francis Maher, who fought on the side of the Union in the American Civil War, which led to the abolition of slavery in 1865. Waterford being Ireland's oldest city and its significant Viking heritage, it has been traced that the Vikings had slaves as far back as the 9th century, so it's most probable that there would have been slaves in Waterford too, African slaves. The connection is reaffirmed in the fact in Old Norse, black men or black people were referred to as Blamader. I hope there's nobody from Viking heritage to pull me up on that one, but Blamader, and which literally means blue man or blue men. And the Gaelic for black man is not far dove, but is actually far gorm, which comes directly from the Old Norse. So that link between the Vikings and this idea that slaves coming in, it would have been most likely been in Waterford and in Ireland at the time of the Vikings. So Daniel O'Connell, the statesman, reformer and staunch abolitionist and emancipationist, took great satisfaction extolling the fact that to MPs in the House of Commons that Ireland had its glory, that no slave ship was ever launched from any of its numerous ports. While the veracity of this claim is open to question, with the last recorded Irish slave ship, a brigantine, the Prosperity, from Limerick, sailing into Barbados on the 31st of July 1718 with 96 slaves aboard, there is no denying that the slave trade had immense benefits for the merchants involved in the provision of goods for the West Indies plantations. As Truxas states, the rapid growth of Ireland's provisioning capacity, largely fed by demand from the Caribbean, was one of the chief stimulants to the development of our principal seaports and market towns. Not only the large towns, but also Derry, Newry, Drogheda and Waterford were intimately tied to the provisioning business. So there was, while Waterford may not have been involved in the slave trade, there was no doubt that merchants here in the city were benefiting from the provisioning of the plantations in the West Indies. Before Douglass, there was a number of prominent black campaigners, abolitionists against slavery, who visited Ireland, and two that I've identified was, one was Olada Ikrenano, who was a Nigerian who came here to Waterford in 1791, and he spoke at the time about the abolition of slavery and his anti-slavery stance, and also Charles Lennox Raymond, who gave 5 lectures here in Waterford in 1841, and he was one of the earliest black abolitionist speakers, and he was born in Massachusetts. Before Douglass, there was two staunch abolitionists who came before him. Also, very interesting caveat I found was in August 1834, slavery was officially abolished in the UK, but early in 1833, a slave ship arrived in Waterford from the Azores, and an African slave with a few words of English came off the ship and was told by some local people on the docks that as a result of setting foot on the United Kingdom soil, he was free, and the slave was reported to have danced with delight. He was then treated to a drink by a local chimney sweep, after which the two went to the mayor's office, and the mayor confirmed that the slave was now free, and the black Irish chimney sweep then left the office arm in arm. I think that's a very nice story. And speaking as somebody who's staunchly opposed to slavery and segregation, it was one of the days I'm most proudest that we were part of the British Empire, and I think it turns out that the ship's captain forfeited a surety of $300 because he failed to deliver the slave to America. So it turns out just walking on the soil of Waterford set his slave free, and I think that's a brilliant point. I'm not going to concentrate too further on these, but just to identify it. So who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born in the state of Maryland in 1818. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was a slave, and the law at the time dictated that all her children automatically became the property of her owner at birth. As Alexis de Tocqueville, the French diplomat, political scientist and historian, eloquently put it, black people enters upon slavery as soon as he or she is born, nay, he may have been purchased in the womb and had begun his slavery before he began his existence. Douglass was taken from his mother's arms at birth. He was only to meet her on a handful of occasions in his life, and Douglass watched as his siblings were sold to other plantations. At the time, slave owners controlled the life of the slave in its entirety, from the food it ate, clothes it wore, whether it could speak, how much work it should do, and by how much it should be punished, and who it should marry or breed with. Also, slaves did not have an identity, to the fact that Douglass was never told his date of birth. He assumed he was born in 1817, but he was actually born in February 1818, but he never knew that fact. So even in his most basic right of knowing where he came from, he was not sure of his birth date. Also, Frederick's slaveholder and believed to be his father was Captain Aaron Anthony, and when Anthony died, Frederick became the property of his son-in-law, Thomas Auld. Auld was a cruel taskmaster and treated his slaves cruelly, a fact which Frederick was to recount in his later lectures. One of Frederick's earliest encounters of Daniel O'Connell had been while a slave, and in his own words, I heard his denunciation of slavery. I heard my master, who was Thomas Auld, curse him, and therefore I loved him. When Frederick was 12 or 13, he was to have a life-changing encounter which steeled his resolve to escape slavery. When walking on the wharf at Baltimore, he saw two Irishmen unloading scroll of stone, and he helped him complete the job. After one of the men asked if Douglass was a slave for life, when Douglass confirmed this, the man was deeply affected and turned to his friend and said that it was a pity that so fine a fellow as Douglass should be a slave for life, and it was a shame to hold him. They both urged Douglass to escape north to be free, and Douglass retrospectively revealed that this conversation gave him great impetus for when he finally escaped from his slave holdings in Maryland in 1838. Escaping from Maryland, he was to move to New York and then settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, taking on a job as a caulker for whaling ships. And to avoid capture, Fredick was at this stage to change his surname from Bailey to Douglass, and they got the spelling of Douglas incorrect, so they added a second S, and that's why it's Douglas with two S's. So, during his time in Massachusetts, he attended anti-slavery meetings, and his big break came in 1841 when he spoke about his slave experiences at the convention of Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. His natural flair and oratorial abilities brought him into the attention of leading figures in the abolitionist anti-slavery movement, and William Lloyd Garrison in particular. Douglass was hired to deliver anti-slavery lectures throughout the northern states, and his reputation and abilities grew. At the same time as his reputation grew, questions began to grow regarding the veracity of his claims. As he said, people doubted if I had ever been a slave. They said I did not look like a slave, talk like a slave, nor act like a slave, and even the abolitionists at the time wanted him to tone down his eloquence, but Frederick used to get up, dressed very professionally and spoke in an eloquent manner, which belied what the stereotype view was of slaves at the time. In an attempt to answer these questions and preserve his reputation, Douglas was to write and publish his memoir in 1845 titled The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And in his memoir he included personal details regarding his background, his master, and this was to increase, and coming from Maryland, this was to increase his possibility of recapture, because under the laws at the time Douglas was a fugitive slave, so as he ran away from his owner in Maryland. So under fear of being arrested and transported back to his slave owner in Maryland, Garrison and the abolitionist movement arranged for Douglas to travel to the United Kingdom and Ireland, and he left Boston for Liverpool in the 16th of August 1845 aboard the Cambria, and Douglas initially docked in Liverpool on the 28th of August before finally arriving in Dublin on the 31st of August 1845. So this is how Douglas came to Ireland. That's how he ended up in Ireland. And coming to Ireland, there was a strong connection between the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society, which had been formed in 1837, and the abolitionist movement in America, and they supported and facilitated Douglas's business and lecture tour in Ireland. One of the most famous abolitionists in Ireland at the time was a Quaker and staunch abolitionist by the name of Richard David Webb. And Webb was also a book printer and publisher, and he was to publish Douglas's edition of his memoirs, his British edition of his memoirs. And Webb also had family throughout the southeast of Ireland in particular, and these were to be used during Douglas's tour around Ireland. The Quakers, as we know, were the first corporate body in Britain and North America to fully condemn slavery, and as they believed it was both ethically and religiously wrong in all circumstances. Their members of the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society tended to take up a range of issues, causes including anti-slavery, temperance, British India, anti-opium, anti-capital punishment, anti-car laws, amongst other causes, and that was to give their members the nickname the Anti-Everythingarians. Over a 4-month period, Douglas was to travel around Ireland, visiting Dublin, Wexford, Cork, Limerick, Galway and Belfast, and he was to visit our own city of Waterford on the 9th of October 1845. He travelled from Wexford, and he spoke on the 8th of October in Wexford, and arriving here in Waterford he was to stay with the Poole family, who were relatives of the Webbs. And in comparison to reports from his time in other locations, there is not a huge amount of information regarding Douglas's visit to Waterford, but what there is very enlightening, and newspaper reports are our best source of information. The Waterford Mail published in advance of his coming that Mr. Douglas is a highly gifted speaker, as we received from his reports of his lectures in the Dublin journals. He evidently possesses a cultivated mind and is most assiduous in adding to his stores of information. We sincerely trust that the Waterford public will show an interest in this matter adequate to its high import. And following the talk on the 9th of October, the Waterford Mail was to publish another report saying that Douglas delivered a lecture on his subject of slavery in a large room of the town hall, and it said, notwithstanding the unfavourable state of the weather, we were glad to perceive that the attendance was both numerous and respectable, and they commended Douglas on his presentation in his lecture. But the claim of a large attendance was rather undone by the publication of a poem in the Waterford Mail on the 18th of October, and I'm now going to ask friend and colleague John Maloney to come and recite this poem that was printed following Douglas's lecture in Waterford, and it was written by Anonymous, and with it they detailed the feelings that this person had to the response that Douglas had. So just I'd call on John now, please.
Thanks to Kieran Cronin for this, and Kieran Murphy for the idea of this unexpected last minute honour. And my hair not even dry yet. Waterford Mail, October 18th, 1845. To the people of Waterford, on their chilling reception of Frederick Douglass. Shame on ye, heartless men of Waterford, who when the slave comes to your hearth and home, to thrill your bosoms with his lightning word, doubtingly question, wherefore does he come? What unto us the woes of cat and cord, of life extinguished, or of soul held dumb? To give us rest and peace, our gentle ears soothe with bland murmurs, if you speak of wrong. We're delicate. Mayhap our exquisite tears should start if troubled by our language strong. Must Douglas shrink from truth to still your fears? Deny the cruel torture felt so long? Blind, craven men, slaves in heart and brain, your souls are dark, your minds confess the chain.
Thanks very much, John. That was brilliant. Yeah, it was so you can see that there was a contrast to what the Waterford Mail had said, and also the claim of larger attendance had been rather undone by that. There's also been the reasons for why the numbers hadn't been so high in the evening. There's been a number of reasons given for this. One was that there was a charge on the door. The second was the adverse weather conditions, and probably my most the one I find most interesting was that they said that there had been popular horse racing in nearby Tramore at the same time, and this was one of the reasons for the lack of people turning up for Douglas's talk. There was also there had been another abolitionist, Moses Roper, who had turned up in Waterford a few years previously, and it seems that he had turned up to give a lecture drunk, and the Waterford people were a bit they were a bit apprehensive about going to abolitionist lectures after that. But for whatever the reason, I believe there's Douglas was to attract large crowds during his time here in Ireland. While in Dublin, he shared a platform with our own Daniel O'Connell, and O'Connell was to dub him the Black O'Connell of America. In Cork, he was to meet Father Theobald Matthew of the Temperance League, and he took his pledge with Father Matthew, and he was delighted to say that he became the 5,487,395th person to make the pledge. And I'm not sure if Father Matthew would approve this morning, but his advice would have been to stay away from the public house, but I don't know about that, I'm telling you, you know. On the eve of his departure from Belfast, Douglas reflected on his isolation. As to the nation I belong to none, the land of my birth welcomes me to her shores only as a slave, and spurns with contempt the idea of treating me differently. I am an outcast from the society of my childhood and an outlaw in the land of my birth. He went on to add, I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country of Ireland. He left Ireland in January 1846 from Belfast and travelled to Scotland, and his lecture tour lasted 20 months, meeting and speaking to large audience, anti-slavery advocates, and raising funds to purchase his freedom. And he finally purchased his freedom in 1846 from his former master for a sum of £150. And Douglas was to return to the United States following his tour of Europe, Ireland, UK, and he settled in Rochester, New York, and began publishing the Northern Star in December 1847. Douglas's time as an abolitionist and as a reformer was really only beginning for the campaign for abolition of slavery in America, and his time here in Ireland really led to a growing of confidence for a start, and also the drive and the belief in his abilities that actually that change was possible. He was involved in the Underground Railroad and instrumental in shepherding many fugitive slaves to Canada. And after the Civil War, Douglas continued to fight tirelessly for African Americans' right to full legal equality, backed by the power of the ballot. He supported the passage of the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments and continued to lecture widely. And in later life, in 1895, when he died, prior to that he was also to attack the Jim Crow laws and also this Jim Crow stereotyping of African Americans, which was increasing in America at this time. So Douglas's influence on the African American resistance campaign for the abolition of slavery and equality was to have a direct impact what was to come in the 1950s and 60s in America, and this was to lead to Douglas being credited as the father of the American Civil Rights Movement. Yeah, of course. So O'Connell's influence on Frederick Douglass is without doubt. O'Connell's agitation politics and his role within bringing public together in terms of the monster meetings, and also the raising civil disobedience was a lesson for the American Anti-Slavery Society and the abolitionist movement. And they credit O'Connell giving abolitionists their first lessons in the techniques of non-violent mass agitation. There is, as you can imagine, there's quite a lot to Douglas's links and his influence on the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. No more so than in the parallels with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was also an eloquent speaker and leader who also belied the stereotype that Jim Crow views would have had at the time. To conclude, why does Frederick Douglass matter in 2016? Douglass still matters because as the unrest has grown in American society, as we see most recently in the summer, there is there needs to be a way for people to engage and to raise their fears and issues in the form of non-violent resistance. And Douglas was always exponent of that. The Black Lives Matter movement was a social movement that developed out of a form of protest that was used to social media and used as a way of people raising their objections to the treatment by police. And the African Americans have a long history of distrust of the police, and also in terms of law enforcement. But I think going forward, Douglas's connection in Waterford will hopefully be discovered in further detail. And thanks very much for listening to me. Cheers.